Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here today to brief you on the federal response to Hurricane Helene. But first, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the lives lost across the region impacted by the hurricane and those survivors whose lives will never be the same. My heart goes out to those who've lost loved ones and those who are worrying about whether their loved ones are still alive. And our administration and our nation is standing with the people impacted by this hurricane. To the disaster survivors across the region, the Biden-Harris administration is committed to supporting you every step of the way as you begin your recovery and you start to heal. For survivors in Florida, North Carolina, and South Carolina, whose governors have requested major disaster declarations, the President approved them immediately over the weekend, and we urge those citizens who are seeking FEMA assistance to sign up for that assistance as quickly as possible. You can do that either by calling 1-800-621-3362, registering on disasterassistance.gov, or by filling out an application on your mobile device through the FEMA app. And that brings me to our response. Under President Biden and Vice President Harris's leadership, we are providing urgent and extensive federal support for the ongoing response and recovery efforts to Hurricane Helene. Over the weekend, at the President's direction, FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell traveled to Florida on Saturday, to Georgia on Sunday, and today she is in North Carolina, accompanying Governor Cooper in surveying impacts to the affected communities in western North Carolina. The President has asked Deanne Criswell to remain in Asheville, North Carolina, given how acute the situation is on the ground there, and he will receive an update from her this afternoon and from Governor Cooper, in addition to the press conference that the Administrator and the Governor will hold today. Also, as the President said earlier today, he is committed to traveling to impacted areas later this week, as soon as his presence will not disrupt vital emergency response operations. So, I want to walk you through what happens as we're facing a hurricane predicted to have the kind of impacts that Helene has had. First of all, what we do before a storm. As Helene was developing in the Gulf, the President directed FEMA to pre-position specialized capabilities across the region, including deploying incident management assistance teams to Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. These teams support our state partners in planning, in logistics, and in conducting their emergency response operations. This included pre-positioning a number of search and rescue teams, federal search and rescue teams in addition to the state and local teams, temporary power teams, generators, and health and medical assessment teams. These efforts focused on the Big Bend area of Florida, saved lives in the state, and they prepared us to respond elsewhere in the region. Now, if we know anything about storms, and we've learned a lot in our years in service together, it's that Mother Nature has a mind of her own. As good as our technologies are, as good as our National Hurricane Center is, it's just a forecast. And when a storm hits, we have to adapt and respond in real time, just as the storm has the effects in real time that it is having, and then there are knock-on effects of that storm, such as flooding. As we evaluated impacts from the storm, we shifted into the post-landfall phase of our process, and we began to surge capacity to where it was needed the most. As of today, we have more than 3,500 federal response personnel deployed and supporting response efforts across the region, including more than 1,000 personnel from FEMA. Search and rescue efforts by state, local, and federal partners are ongoing, and nearly 600 additional personnel will arrive in the region in the coming days, increasing the total number of urban search and rescue personnel to over 1,250. And as search and rescue missions in other states wind down, these teams are focusing on the areas of greatest need, including North Carolina, where our federal teams continue to support state and local teams with rescues where the devastation is most acute. Also, at the President's direction, the Department of Defense has activated additional helicopters to aid in search and rescue operations and has provided dozens of high water vehicles to get into areas that it's difficult to access. The National Guard in their state capacity is also supporting these efforts. National Guardsmen and women from 8 additional states are supporting North Carolina under existing emergency mutual assistance compacts known as EMACs, with more than 700 personnel, helicopters, a cargo plane, and rescue vehicles to help with road clearance, provision of commodities, transportation, and search and rescue. This is the best of America. We have National Guard coming in as far as from Connecticut, Ohio, and New York, who are deploying to North Carolina to support their fellow citizens in need. In addition, about 200 medical responders are also stationed in Florida, Alabama, and North Carolina, along with medical equipment and supplies, to ensure the continued health care delivery that is required following the landfall of Hurricane Helene. And the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services declared a public health emergency for Florida, North Carolina, and Georgia, which gives health providers and suppliers greater flexibility in meeting emergency health needs of Medicare and Medicaid beneficiaries. In order for communities to begin functioning again, we all know it's critical to have power restored. And I want to tell you about what we're doing on this front, because that is truly the fundamental lifeline sector. As of this morning, about 2 million people are still without power across the impacted states. At least 50,000 personnel from 31 states and DC and Canada are responding to power outages throughout the region via established mutual assistance agreements between utilities, and working around the clock throughout parts of Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina to restore power to those communities that can receive it, where the infrastructure can take power on the lines. FEMA and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers are also making available generators of many different sizes that are ready to be deployed upon the request of any state. And as power is being restored throughout parts of Florida and Georgia, power crews are being moved into other states to assist with additional restoration efforts. We see power outage numbers improving where restoration teams are able to gain access to communities and the debris is cleared. Once we get power restored, we can then get a lot of other things working again. Utilities, water utilities in particular, communication systems, medical and healthcare facilities are those capabilities that depend, of course, on a source of power supply to function. We're also very focused on restoring communications capabilities. FEMA, the FCC, and private telecommunications providers are working together to help restore temporary communications as quickly as possible by establishing temporary cell sites and allowing for roaming where possible, where a resident can connect to any network available even if they aren't subscribed to that network. Today, FEMA will install 30 Starlink receivers in western North Carolina to provide immediate connectivity for those in greatest need. We're also very focused on how we reach survivors at their point of need. This has been a lesson we have learned from the beginning of President Biden's presidency, that those who most need the help have the hardest time accessing that help. And he has directed us to work to evolve FEMA practices so we can really get to those who need us the most. In states that have requested and have received major disaster declarations, FEMA is expediting the delivery of its serious needs assistance, which is an immediate $750 direct payment to eligible households to allow them to pay for essential items like food, baby formula, water, medications, and other emergency supplies. This is not the full extent of FEMA assistance to individuals, but it's the first element of it that becomes immediately available with a major disaster declaration. And it gets people cash when they're absolutely desperate for it. In addition, survivors who register for the FEMA Individual Assistance Program will be eligible to receive assistance to help repair their homes, cars, and other personal property in conjunction with their own insurance policies. FEMA is working, as it always does, to open disaster recovery centers in impacted communities. What's important about these centers is they aggregate federal support in one place. It used to be the case that survivors had to go to multiple different departments and agencies to find out what kind of help they could get access to. What we do is we put everyone together either in a standing building that survived the natural disaster or in a trailer if that's necessary. For example, we've opened 3 disaster recovery centers today in Manatee County, Sarasota County, and Hillsborough County, Florida. If survivors cannot get to such a facility, and we think that will likely be the place in a place like Asheville and its surrounding areas, we send people door to door. FEMA literally goes knocking with an iPad in hand so they can help people register for the assistance they need, because they may not have power, their cell phone may have run out, and they need someone to help them get registered quickly. In North Carolina, we're focused right now on clearing roads and removing debris, restoring communications and power, and ensuring access to health care and the continued flow of commodities and food, commodities like food and water, to where they're most needed. Today, we've heard they've reopened 220 roads, which will help enable responders and critical commodities to begin moving via ground transportation. While FEMA has been at the forefront of the response, and it's very meaningful to have them on the ground, they serve as the coordinator of the orchestra of a wide-ranging federal response, and that's something a lot of people don't understand. What FEMA does is it mission assigns, that's the term of art, quote, mission assigns, roles and responsibilities across our government in the wake of a disaster. And so what they do is coordinate the identification of and delivery of those resources when they're needed and where they're needed. I want to go through some of what other departments and agencies are doing so you can hear the full scope of the federal response, which gives more clarity than just saying FEMA is doing this. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers deployed power restoration teams, including in Buncombe County, North Carolina, where Asheville is located, for temporary emergency power, debris removal, and infrastructure assessment, including for dams throughout the region. The Department of Defense has mobilized 22 helicopters in support to response in western North Carolina. Staged at Fort Liberty in North Carolina, there are multiple helicopters available to support air bridge operations to move personnel and necessary supplies and equipment into the disaster area. 4 helicopters from DoD are actively supporting the urgent search and rescue operations that are ongoing in western North Carolina. The other 18 are helping to move response personnel and deliver critical commodities and support into remote and isolated communities that are not accessible by road right now. DoD has also made available, as I mentioned, 30 high-water vehicles available for search and rescue, and has set up 5 incident support bases across the region to continue providing support to those who need it in the surrounding areas. The U.S. Coast Guard has thousands of personnel working on response efforts and is conducting post-storm assessments to support the rapid reopening of impacted ports in Florida. The U.S. Department of Energy has responders deployed across the region, primarily in the state emergency operations centers. While I noted that power restoration numbers are trending in the right direction, it's important to remember that these will be complex multi-day efforts in many locations due to the extent of damage and the ongoing access issues. Utilities are facing widespread flooding and debris that is impeding access to damaged infrastructure, and one of the things we've learned in prior incidents like this is it's really important to set public expectations about when they can anticipate that power will return so that they take the necessary steps to be safe and to secure additional support, for example, moving into a shelter if power isn't going to come on for some time where they live. The U.S. Department of Agriculture's Farm Service Agency, a very important player in this space in rural areas, has deployed personnel to the impacted region to extend much-needed emergency credit to farmers and agriculture producers who lost crops and livestock across all the impacted states, but in particular in the Big Bend region of Florida and in southern Georgia. The Environmental Protection Agency has personnel on the ground who are offering technical assistance and guidance on water systems, which have been significantly damaged in a number of locations, on debris management, and on maintaining critical public health and environmental protections as storm impacts are assessed. The U.S. Small Business Administration has also deployed more than 50 personnel to support survivors and small businesses as they recover from the hurricane. So, that's a sense for you of the range of capabilities that surge when we say we're doing everything we can to help impacted communities. And more will follow as we know more about the impacts. We honestly don't know the full extent of the damage. It probably will take several more days as communities begin to be opened up by the debris clearance on the roads, and we can get in and really understand what's happened to them. Unfortunately, we know that the first information we receive is often wrong in the wake of a disaster, and that the early days are brutally hard for the people who are in the most heavily impacted communities. Since 2021, we have seen this play out across the nation, from Florida to California to Maui, from Kentucky to New York. As the President has directed, we will do everything we can, first to save lives, alleviate suffering, and help communities to recover and eventually rebuild. And we will focus especially on survivors who have the hardest time accessing the help we can provide, as I noted, because as Americans, we are all in this together. Thank you for giving me a chance to lay that down for you, and I'm glad to take a few questions.